Imagine asking someone to open to the first book of Samuel, chapter 17, so they can read the story of David and Goliath, or discussing the famous story of the oven of Achnai on Bava Metzia 59b, or quoting Justice, Justice, you shall pursue from Devarim, chapter 16, verse 20. Those references feel as though they've always existed, but in fact, they haven't. This is History Makers, a series where I introduce you to the people who shaped and reshaped Jewish history. Our next history maker is Daniel Bomberg, the man who permanently changed the way that Jews navigate both the Tanakh and the Talmud. Unfortunately, we have no contemporary pictures or artwork featuring him, so we only have artist interpretations, and that's the image that I'm using in this video. If you've never studied the Talmud before, here's the short version. The Babylonian Talmud isn't a single book. It's an enormous collection of discussions, debates, legal arguments, stories, and interpretations compiled over several centuries by generations of rabbis. It became one of the foundational texts of Rabbinic Judaism, shaping Jewish law, education, and religious life for nearly 1,500 years. Today, wherever Jews study the Talmud, in Jerusalem, London, New York, Melbourne, Johannesburg, they almost all navigate it exactly the same way. Someone says, let's learn Sanhedrin 37a. Everyone immediately knows where to turn. The same is true of the Hebrew Bible. If someone says, open to Judges chapter 6, or read Bamidbar 25:7, millions of Jews can find those passages within seconds. It's easy to forget that somebody had to create that shared system. For most of Jewish history, books were copied entirely by hand. Every manuscript was different. The words might be identical, but the presentation usually wasn't the same. One manuscript placed a commentary in the margin, another copied it at the end. One scribe began a passage halfway down a page, another started it on the next page entirely. Even though chapter divisions had already existed for centuries in the Latin Christian world, and Jewish scholars had begun using them in certain circumstances, no Hebrew Bible had ever printed those chapter numbers as part of the biblical text itself. There was no universally recognized way for every Jew to find the same passage. Then, in the early 16th century, a remarkable printing house opened in Venice. Its owner assembled some of the finest Jewish scholars of his generation, including, for example, Rabbi Meir Katznellenbogen, better known as the Maharam Padua, along with other leading editors and proofreaders and typesetters. Their task wasn't simply to reproduce manuscripts. It was to produce editions that Jewish communities everywhere could use. In 1517, the press published the first edition of what became known as the Mikraot Gedolot, the Great Scriptures. For the first time, a printed Hebrew Bible incorporated chapter numbers directly into the text itself, while surrounding the biblical text with the classic Jewish commentators such as Rashi, Ibn Ezra, Ramban, and others in a carefully designed layout. That innovation seems quite ordinary today. At the time, it fundamentally changed how Jews found, taught, discussed, and cross-referenced the Bible. Then came the even greater achievement. Between 1520 and 1523, the same press produced another landmark publication, the first complete printed edition of the Babylonian Talmud. Not simply selected tractates, the Sonsino family had done that, the entire Talmud. Its editors established a page unlike anything that had existed before. The Mishnah and Gemara occupied the center. Rashi's commentary appeared along the inside margin. The commentaries of the Tosafot, Rashi's grandchildren, faced it on the outside. Other commentaries further framed the discussion. It created a visual conversation on the page itself, but perhaps the most influential decision was almost invisible, an entirely new system for numbering pages. The familiar references of Brachot 2a, Shabbat 31a, Yoma 69a, Makot 24b trace back to this edition. For the first time, Jews separated by thousands of kilometers could literally be on the same page when discussing Gemara. Teachers could assign readings, scholars could write commentaries, communities could discuss identical passages without confusion. The Talmud became easier to teach, easier to print, and easier to study together. Now here's the twist. The man responsible for all of this wasn't Jewish. He was a Christian printer. Daniel Bomberg recognized the importance of Hebrew scholarship, invested an enormous amount of his own fortune in producing the finest Hebrew books of his age, and trusted leading Jewish scholars to edit them. He understood that his job wasn't to rewrite Jewish tradition, it was to give it the finest possible printed form. Printing Hebrew books was unbelievably expensive. The audience was understandably relatively small. Bomberg poured a huge amount of his personal fortune into the project, and eventually he lost a great deal of his wealth. Then history took another cruel turn. In 1553, only a few decades after Bomberg's magnificent editions appeared, Pope Julius III ordered the public burning of the Talmud. Thousands of copies were destroyed in Rome's Campo di Fiori, and similar burnings followed across Italy. Many of the books Bomberg had worked so hard to produce disappeared into the flames, but his ideas didn't. Later printers rebuilt their editions using Bomberg's layout. His page design became the definitive standard. His pagination became the language of Jewish learning itself. 5 centuries later, whether someone opens a printed Vilna Shas, studies on Sefaria, attends a Daf Yomi class, or quotes Tanit 23a, they're still following the navigational system established in Daniel Bomberg's Venetian workshop. It's a reminder that history isn't shaped only by people who create and write great ideas. Sometimes it's shaped by the people who decide how everyone else will find them. Daniel Bomberg didn't change a word of the Tanakh or the Talmud. What he changed was the way that generations of Jews would encounter them. And that is why Daniel Bomberg is this week's History Maker.